Wedging is one of the first essential skills that any potter who's going to throw on the wheel really should be able to master. So wedging can be done with fresh clay or recycled clay. So this is fresh clay from a block. Now, do you have to necessarily wedge when it comes from a block? No, but I do tell my students that it will help them to have a little bit more success if they, as beginners, take their clay back to the wheel and it is not shaped like a square block, because you're going to make something round from it. So I think my students have a much easier time when they do a little bit of wedging first. Now, wedging is very similar to kneading bread dough. So when I wedge, it's a push and then a turn. Push and turn. You know what? I'm just going to combine both of these so it's a larger hunk of clay and you can see it a little bit more easily. So I'm going to push and rotate it. Push and rotate it. Now, wedging will also help to realign the particles a little bit. This particular clay that I'm using right here, this is B-mix. And B-mix tends to be a little bit on the stiff side when it's in the bag, but as soon as you start to wedge it, it helps to kind of loosen it up. So some clays do this, some clays aren't necessarily that way. Now, as I wedge, I push, turn, and then I'm just going to rotate it in a different direction after maybe a half dozen turns. Now, the purpose of this is I do want to kind of realign the particles a little bit, and I also want to mix any maybe slightly drier areas and softer areas so they have a uniform moisture to it. This clay was already pretty uniformly moist, so I shouldn't have to worry about it that much. Now, you can see that there's a little bit of a spiral going, a spiral action that's happening right here. One thing that I do tell my students that sometimes helps, instead of putting the spiral down on your bat, maybe turn it so the spiral is sideways. The reason for that is sometimes when there's a spiral right on the bottom, people sometimes get some cracks that will occur when you're throwing and after, and like during the drying process. Now I'm just going to make this more into a ball shape. And I'm actually going to make it slightly more of an oblong. That way I know that when I put it down, it's going to be taller than it is wide. And I did this specifically so I could remember where the spiral was, and I'm putting the spiral more in the side rather than in the bottom. Now, let's talk about wedging recycled clay. So when I am working with clay, I'll put my trimmings and my scrap into a bucket and I just spritz it down. So as I'm working, it stays in pretty good condition. I try to avoid drying it out if I can, because when you dry it out, then of course that is even more work to get it back to the usable stage. So I'm just going to start wedging this. Now, right at the beginning, it seems kind of messy because I'm incorporating some slightly wetter spots and drier spots, but this will become perfect usable clay here in another minute. So keep in mind that when you're wedging, you push and then rotate it into itself. Push, rotate it into itself. The one mistake that sometimes my kids make, and I'm going to show you what not to do, is sometimes they push and they flatten it out way too much. So like they push and they make it really flat like this. And then when they fold it over on itself, you are inevitably going to trap giant air bubbles. So air bubbles and lumps are completely your enemy when you are throwing on the wheel. You want to make sure that everything about your clay is even in moisture It's consistent. If you have any like lumps, like leather hard lumps, you will either need to remove all those lumps or just start over with clay that doesn't have it. So the clay that was in this bucket that I'm recycling, I know that none of that was leather hard. It was all still in the plastic stage, or maybe the slightly firmer plastic stage that when I spritzed it, that added water made it nice and workable. I do have another video on how to recycle clay in my home studio without a pug mill. If you would like to see that, I have another video on how to use a pug mill, a Peter Pugger that I have at school. Currently, I do not have a pug mill at home. I would like to get one sometime, a small one. So this is wedging up very nicely. It's feeling really consistent. Now, one of the things that I always do, I'm going to grab this. One of the things that I always do whenever I am wedging up scrap, I don't necessarily do this with brand new clay, but with scrap, I will cut it. The reason that I cut it is because if you happen to have lumps or air bubbles, you'll be able to see it in there when you cut it. And this is looking just right. So now that it's cut, the way that I put these together is I'm going to take these slices, I'm going to turn them vertically, and I'm going to smack them down. And then I'm going to just smack them one into each other. So here we go. So see, it's vertical, and I'm going to smack it down. All right. Now that they've been smacked, I'm just going to continue to wedge just like I was doing. Again, that cutting is really important when you especially have clay that's of a lot of different consistencies and you need to really get it incorporated and mixed together. This clay it's basically like brand new clay at this point. Feels great. Okay. And if you remember what we talked about before with the spiral, so the spiral is going like this because that was in the bottom. You know, it's very common to just take it and put it down like that, which you can. And I've done that for years, but it's when you might have a problem with cracking. This could be one of the culprits. So if you find that you have any cracking issues, just try taking that spiral, turning the ball sideways. See if that will help you. All right, so I'm going to round these up, and then we can go over to the wheel, and I'm going to show you how we're going to get started.